Welcome, everyone. I'm Heather Riggs, Director of Administration here at NEMA, and I just want to welcome everybody today to our environmental community of practice. I'm actually going to turn it over to our chair, Matt Kirchman, to formally kick us off for today's session.
Sure. Thanks, Heather. And thank you to all of you for arriving today and helping us get started here, and for contributing to the chat conversation. I can see that many of you have been there, many of you have not been there. Some of you have been there a long time ago. That is absolutely what we expected. So this is, the program is really for people who are familiar with the property or not, or completely unfamiliar with the property. The success of this program does not hinge upon your familiarity with the House of the Seven Gables. Um, when you think of the House of the Seven Gables, you might think of a single historic house with a particularly configured roof line. But I'm here to tell you that the House of the Seven Gables is really a lot more than that. It's a 2-acre historic district comprising a half dozen or so historic structures and features. And Susan and Paul's conversation is really in the context of a larger mini campus of historic structures and features. As a Salem resident myself, and a consultant to the House of the Seven Gables for their interpretive plan, I know the structure quite well. And of course, I know the story. Storytelling at the museum centers on the making and remaking of the House of the Seven Gables and its grounds, and the means and motivations of its various owners and visitors over time. Some 356 years ago, the namesake house, the House of the Seven Gables, also called the Turner Ingersoll Mansion, was made spectacular by maritime prosperity during the Great Age of Sail, the wealth of Turner and Ingersoll sea captains and their families. It was made famous by a great American novel written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who visited his cousin, Susanna, who inherited the house after her father's death at sea. The Gables was made widely useful, public, and interpretive through settlement services in Salem, thanks to the philanthropic work of Carolyn Emerton in establishing a settlement home on the property. And now we fast forward to the present day, and the house is being remade yet again. It's being made safe, efficient, and sustainable through the work of a team of historians and preservationists. And we have two of them here today. Susan Baker is curator of collections. She's responsible for the institution's diverse collections and archives and their long-term health and well-being. She's been involved in a number of short and long-term projects to improve the environmental controls and management of the collections, both those on exhibit and those held in the archival storage spaces. Mr. Paul Wright joined the House of the Seven Gables as Director of Preservation and Maintenance about 3 years ago. As an architectural historian, he is leading the organization in studying the effects of climate change on the historic site. He also brings his former experience as a building envelope and energy code consultant to today's conversation, and he brings that expertise to his place of employment now. So with that, unless I said anything wrong, Susan or Paul, if there's any.
No, I think the only thing you forgot to mention was that we are right on Salem Sound. So within 30 feet
Yes,
of our
very,
houses is the ocean. So that's an important
very,
part of
very
our
good point. You are,
climate
yeah,
adaptation work.
you're as coastal a property as it gets in Salem, Massachusetts. Yeah. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul. I think he's going to kick
Yeah,
off.
yeah, absolutely. So I'll start sharing my screen while I'm doing that. I'll just remark I'm really excited to see how many people turned out for this. This all came about sort of an um, impromptu conversation at the last ECOP get together. So not at NEMA conference, but we had a nice get together. Joie Gramboy hosted a bunch of people over at, I'm forgetting the name of the house now, but it was in Boston. I know she's on this call, so she's.
It's a historic New England property.
Yes, it is a
Yeah.
historic New England property in Boston, and I think it was the Pierce House. Hopefully,
Yes.
just having a conversation about thermostats and dealing with temperature controls and how tricky it can be in historic houses, and just thought an off the cuff conversation. And Paul Fenton was there, and he said this would be a great talk. And I wasn't sure if other people would be, but I'm glad to see that other people are really interested in this. Susan and I have been working the last couple of years very involved in our climate adaptation plan. So that's sort of on the other side of this, where we've been spending quite a lot of time trying to come up with an adaptation plan for climate change, which we know is going to be impacting our site. This is the other side of that coin, where we're looking at climate mitigation. And I'm kind of excited to kind of flex some of my pre-Gables experience at this point. We actually spent quite a while with a CAP grant that we underwent an assessment to study what our collections look like, and how our collection storage is being handled, and how we can improve that. And so a lot of the elements of this came from that CAP assessment. So we'll get into that kind of as we go underway. I did have as everyone see that? I'm on our second slide. So we've already been introduced. So I guess I can kind of skip that. Although I will say one other thing, which is that a little bit of my background and experience as before coming to the Gables was as a BPI, building analyst and envelope specialist. I put a little star in there. I'm no longer credentialed. So those credentials expired about 4 or 5 years ago. And also HERS Rater, same thing. These are basically professional certifications for assessments, both for energy efficiency and envelope design, primarily in the residential scheme. So I actually spent, if anyone's familiar with the Mass Save program, quite a long time working in that program, both in the existing building and new construction. So working with homeowners, working with builders, and but yeah, so I don't know, Susan, if you had anything else you wanted to add from Matt's introduction as well.
No, that's fine. I think Matt covered it well.
Very good. Okay. So then I'm going to jump right in with a couple of building science basics. And for some people, this may be very obvious basic things. Others not. I don't know what everyone's coming in here in the museum world. We have a lot of humanities people who are not necessarily versed in this. And when I came into it, I was a history major, just looking for good employment, and construction work was probably the best thing I could find in 2011. And so weatherization, insulation was that, and came about finding that I was really passionate about the ways that historic buildings intersected with building science, physics even, and a little bit of chemistry too. So first we'll just start off our 3 main modes of heat transfer: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is the passage of heat through solid material, essentially the movement of molecules transferring heat. Tends to be what people think of heat movement when they're, you touch hopefully you don't touch a hot stove, but feeling a warm wall. Convection is another major movement of heat that people tend to think of when they're thinking of heat transfer. And that happens through a couple of different ways, but 2 of the more, I think, impactful forms of convection heat movement, and this is the fluid movement of heat, is through stack effect. So that means that, and I think you should all be able to see my mouse, cool air is drawn in and then forced up like a chimney. So basically, and this is more in the cooling season, heating season, it can flip and reverse. But in New England, we tend to think of cooling season. But cool air is drawn in down low and pushed up down low. And then convection loops, which is if that air becomes trapped, it rises and falls within the envelope of the house. And that convection loop can be important for a couple of things. For one, it's why we might feel a draft, even if we're not standing near anything that's, drafty, leaky. And it also is really important in terms of drying, certain elements of the building or inside the building. And then the last one, which is very important, it's the reason why we're all able to exist on this planet, but you think about it a little bit less in your day-to-day application, is radiation. So radiation comes from basically every object radiates out heat. The sun radiates and creates most of the energy on Earth, but every object inside a building is also radiating heat. It's basically waves of energy that are transferred not through air, not through solid, but basically EMF. And so those three things are in constant interplay with each other in the building. I very much am focused on the way that these three forces interact inside the interstitial parts of the wall. This is really important. So we have our little diagram here: outside, inside, sun hitting solar radiation on the wall. We also have, of course, convection moving along the outside of the wall. It's warming up this solid wall surface. This is the exterior portion of the wall. You usually have a gap in a wall. I'm primarily focused on wood construction here. Masonry construction can get a lot more complicated. Some of the basics still apply, but of course, you get different forces at play with solid masonry. But then, so you don't have like the convection that's happening inside the interstitial spaces in the wall, or the radiation that's going between the inner wall and the outer wall. But you will have the conduction forces going between the outside and the inside. So, and then again, the conduction on the inside wall and how that transfers out. These are all really important factors that come into play as you're kind of trying to understand how are we preserving a building. How are we keeping it? Because the ultimate thing that we care about as preservationists and trying to preserve a historic building is keeping things dry, keeping water away. Water is the ruiner of all things, and one of the major deteriorating factors in historic buildings. So how can we keep that moisture managed? How does heat transfer through all three different of these forms of heat transfer? Help keep the building dry. So the other thing to know, this is Fourier's law, which is that basically, and without getting too much into the math, that the greater the temperature difference between inside and outside, the greater the pressure. So warm wants to go to cold. The greater the warm on the inside, and the greater the cold on the outside, the more air wants to drive through any leaks and openings in that wall, whether those leaks are around window openings, gaps around sashes, outlets, gaps in your sheathing, anything that's in the building that might let air through. And then the other thing to know is that warm air holds more moisture. This is Dalton's law. And basically, it's water vapor can remain suspended the warmer that the air around it is. So that means that that also increases the pressure. There's more fluid in a gaseous state, so that increases pressure. And so it increases drive through building assemblies. But then it also, trying to forget what my other point was there. But basically, that warm air holds more moisture. And that's something that's important to know as you're going through planning your building assemblies. Okay. Then the other thing to know is that, getting in a little bit into the history of mechanical climate controls in historic buildings, of course, is that before mechanical climate controls was ubiquitous, we had very different conditions for these historic buildings. And again, House of Seven Gables, primarily for historic wooden buildings that date from the 1600s and 1700s that we have to consider on our site. So humans had different standards of comfort during those times before mechanical controls were different. During the heating season, it would be 60 degrees would be, and in the winter would be quite warm. People typically had much lower heating standards. So the building envelope was not used to this very high heat loads that were being we now put inside them. There also was a lot more passive controls to manage comfort. So part of that, of course, is about, and again, speaking very locally or regionally about the New England climate. For one thing, AC didn't become ubiquitous in our area until fairly recently, and obviously wasn't introduced really at all until the middle or early 20th century. But people did get uncomfortable in the winter, and they also always had to deal with moisture and humidity buildup in the house. But they used, for the most part, passive controls to manage that. So operable windows and shutters, overhangs to reduce solar gain, internal ventilation, transoms and air shafts, and then kind of going back more to the heating side, but certainly can be applied in different climates for cooling as well, is that building orientation was very important. Building siting was very important for things like maximizing solar exposure, facing a house with its windows towards the south. If you have a primarily heating climate, if you're a primarily cooling climate, kind of doing the opposite, finding prevailing winds and orienting your house to catch prevailing winds. But then we went and introduced HVAC systems, and we've completely changed how we work with these buildings. So I'm going to get a little bit into a couple of cross sections here to talk about how, heating or overheating a building, heating them to our current comfort standards that we have today, which is generally around 70 degrees Fahrenheit for heating and cooling. And there's obviously some variation for that for everyone's personal comfort, but I'm kind of using that as a basic or as a baseline here. But mechanical climate controls. So right, what we have here is a very traditional building system. We have our outside cladding. This is like clapboards on the outside. And this is our exterior sheathing, which I've put little gaps in here. And then our interior plaster, which I've left gaps in here to introduce. But traditionally, you're heating with fire or maybe a coal stove or something. And that environment was definitely warm. It may or may not have been moist. Now, I add this in here because we really also want to talk about condensation and how moisture moves through a building in the heating season. Now, when you're burning wood, actually wood gives off a lot of moisture. So there would have been a lot of moisture being introduced. That said, during the winter and the dry season, that moisture relative to like what it would be during a hot summer day is quite low. But there's still moisture in there. And during a very, so looking at this kind of traditional building assembly, it was not unusual for mechanical controls to have lots of condensation appearing on the inside of a house. And you may still see that in a house that's very poorly insulated today. So the condensation plane is where, when that warm, moist air hits that cold interior wall, it's going to start collecting dew or condensation. So it could be in the interior of the wall. If you have it just, you drive it just a little bit warmer, it might actually be on the inside of the interior or within the wall at some point in the interstitial space. But you'll see frost in windows, and that's kind of the same thing. You have that cold, that warm, moist air hitting that very cold surface on the outside. Now, if that happened in an interstitial space, the studs that are inside the space, or if you warmed it up enough that you could keep this wall a little bit warmer, and it was depositing itself in here on the outer wall, this is called a convective loop, as I mentioned. So warm air is rising, and then as it cools, it drops, and it's drying out this assembly. So there's a lot of people who say, buildings must breathe, and as someone who has helped insulate many buildings, I've often taken, wanted to make exceptions, because you can detail a building so it doesn't need to breathe like this. But circumstances with a historic building, it's very difficult to do it that way. And this works very well because it's very forgiving. Moisture comes in, say through a gap on the exterior wall. This is also helping that process. So if you get leaks for other reasons, there's a windowsill that has a leak, this convective loop is constantly keeping these interior walls dry. So it's very helpful for the preservation of the building to let this energy transfer happen, this convection air movement move through the building. I might get into this a little bit later. The conductive transfer of air is also good, or transfer of heat is also good for the building, because even if this is solid and but the conduction still moves through there, it will also help dry out eventually the exterior siding if it gets wet. I'm going to jump ahead because I want to make sure I'm keeping time here.
Paul, we do
Yeah.
have a question that's
Oh,
relevant
sure.
to this situation, so sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah,
How
go
does a
ahead.
stone building differ to a frame building with these principles? Less condensation, isn't there a lag in effect?
Yeah. So first I'll caveat and say that the stone building is a little bit less not my specialty, but like I kind of mentioned earlier, there are the same similarities, except you just don't have that interstitial space where that allows the air drying. What you do have is the mortar gaps. And so this is why people say it's so important to repoint mortar buildings with a soft mortar. So that allows basically moisture. So you still have a thermal drive through a masonry building. So if you imagine this is solid, um, you don't necessarily usually have a cladding on the outside of the building. The outer skin of a masonry building is the masonry itself, and that masonry will get wet. And what happens is that that wetness wants to, you know, basically the convective transfer through there is going to push water around, and it's going to look for the weakest spaces to kind of do that. And usually that is the soft mortar. So you want that to be something that's more, I don't want to say durable. It's sacrificial, essentially. So it'll push that moisture back out. If it's too hard, it'll basically put pressure on the stone, and then if it freezes, it'll crack the stone or break. But yeah, you have a lot of the same forces. You just don't have that drying that's happening with the convective loop inside. I hope I kind of touched on that okay. So my next slide here is with, I would say, a moderate amount of air sealing happen. So I've put in right here this black plane. This is like an air sealing membrane. And so that actually will slow the amount of air coming in here. It might slow down the convective loop. It will allow this wall to warm up. Generally, once you've air sealed, you help the house to warm the inner side of the wall, and of course, obviously, so many different variables. It also would also be driving less moisture into the wall from the interior, so you may get condensation coming in, but it will be generally less because you're getting less moisture going through the envelope because you reduce the amount of airflow through the envelope. And then I've also just put in, if you put in insulation, what happens? So in our buildings at the Gables, we have a mix. Our buildings were brought in as, collections to be preserved, but they've also been throughout the years constantly kind of, treated in basically what is the most convenient, helpful thing for us to run as a museum. So we've done interventions which maybe are not always the most preservation minded, but trying to help the museum operate. So we have some buildings that are on our site that have been insulated. They were done probably in the 70s or 80s, which of course that was the time when people were really getting into that. They weren't done very consistently, so I have my concerns about them, but it's good to know that basically what that does is, so it won't necessarily, if you add insulation, unless it's an insulation that is a vapor retarding insulation, so like spray foam, which I would not recommend. Generally, it's not going to actually stop that much air moving. It's the air control layers that do that. So air sealing, whether that's building skin or, actually going around and sealing up gaps around the exterior. That's what slows down the air movement. But what this will do is actually create, and these are porous insulation, fiberglass, cellulose, mineral wool, will actually create an area inside the envelope where the condensation plane is actually moved to sort of an arbitrary point somewhere between where it transitions from warm to cold. And again, you've slowed down. If you air seal, the insulation should always be done with air sealing. Because what you want to do is reduce the amount of moisture that is going into that interstitial space. So the more you air seal, the less moisture that will be going into this interstitial space that will need to be dried out. Obviously you've cut down very much on the amount of air movement that's happening. You're not going to get that convective loop in the same way, even if air is still moving through that fibrous insulation. It is dramatically cut. So it's coming to the point where you are trying to almost turn this into a solid masonry, or sorry, not like a solid masonry, but a solid unit. So then what happens though if you turn down the temperature and decrease the temperature difference, or the delta T, between inside and outside? Well, you're going to reduce the air pressure, so there's going to be less drive of air pressure between the inside and outside, which will again serve to push less moisture into this cavity here. So it can be another added benefit, a better protection or insurance to your building cavity. So then you got to kind of flip things around in summer, of course, and think about how that'll affect things. And that's a difficult thing because a lot of these buildings were built with a primarily heating season mindset. So, obviously you've got warm outside, very humid in New England, and that will try and penetrate through sheathing. It'll condensate, and if you are cooling the inside, again, so this is with modern climate controls, then you'll have a condensation plane on the interior side of the wall, or interior side within the cavity. So that deposits moisture in there, which is not a good thing. Obviously, a lot more moisture in that wall. If you have the convective loop again, though, it's helping dry it a little bit. You do a little bit of air sealing, though. So this is, again, that building moisture control layer that's put there. Tar paper is really the most common that you see on a lot of historic houses. We have tar paper on all of our buildings, and that actually does serve to help cut down. But of course, then what happens is that condensation happens between your cladding layer and your sheathing. And then you might start to see a high buildup of condensation, up against, behind your siding. Not great, but better than it is, because it's easier to replace your siding than it is to replace your walls. And then of course that reduces the airflow into there, into the interstitial space. And then, I would just also mention that adding insulation would reduce some of that condensation to the exterior, because you would be keeping this exterior wall a little bit warmer, more like the exterior temperature. So there is a benefit to that. But the other thing you can do, of course, is to increase your temperature on the inside and decrease the temperature difference. So this is without adding the control layer, the building control layer, adding insulation. And what you've done is that you've decreased the amount of, I forgot to move that. These are all my own diagrams that I've made, but basically, so what you'll do is that you'll have less drive from the outside into the inside, because the pressure difference will be reduced. So there's two conclusions to kind of what I've shown you all here, is that you can stop damage from moisture migration through wall assemblies. You either must have a tightly controlled building envelope with insulation and vapor control layers that are perfectly detailed, or B, the building must be allowed to fluctuate in temperature more in line with the exterior, which would decrease the temperature and pressure differential between inside and outside, and then keep dry through heat transfer through the wall assembly. So basically letting the building breathe the way that it was originally designed to work. So there's a couple of drawbacks to doing either one. Problems to doing A, which is, building or redoing the historic building as the current, like a modern building, is removal and replacement of entire cladding system to install a vapor control assembly. If you have original building fabric on the outside, you really don't want to do that. The installation of wall insulation, which is typically non-reversible. There's some cases where you could maybe consider it reversible, but it's very difficult. And in terms of preservation guidelines, that's not ideal. And then also, even if perfectly detailed, an insulated wall allows less heat to transfer to dry out exterior cladding, which will increase your maintenance. It basically means you'll have to paint your siding more often. So I mentioned sort of how heat transfer through will dry out your siding after a heavy rain. If it takes longer for that siding to dry, your siding is going to swell up and will buckle paint more quickly. But then, so problems with doing B include, which is, of course, going back to a more natural air movement for historic buildings, is dealing with modern human expectations of comfort. And there's also legal requirements for that as well in the state of Massachusetts, which is something that I had to double check on that. You have to keep people comfortable because we're living in the 21st century and people don't want to sit in, offices that are 55 or, lower degrees. And also the protection of collection items that are sensitive to changes in temperature and humidity. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Susan.
Paul, just one second. I did have a question come in. Is there a way of mixing A and B? Or we can answer this after Susan's part.
Yeah, let's get into that because I'll just say that our approach has actually been doing B, but in a very slow manner. So, okay. Yeah, and we'll get into a little bit of that.
Okay, and then Michael, we'll wait for your question until after Suzanne's section.
Great. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the collections we have at the Gables and why environmental controls inside the houses are so key to the overall health of the collections. So the Gables, we have lots of furniture, beautiful furniture from the North Shore in Salem. We have textiles, ceramics, glass, some beautiful historic clocks, musical instruments, objects made with metal, copper, fireplace implements, all sorts of other things, lots of painting of prints. And these are examples that are kind of a combination. So the woman in the picture, that's actually both glass and paint and wood in that it's a reverse glass painted genre portrait from China that includes paint, glass, and wood. We have this beautiful porcelain piece, which is also gilded. So you have metal and porcelain combined. And then we have some really, really important pieces of furniture, including this desk owned by Nathaniel Hawthorne that he wrote the Scarlet Letter on. So stewarding these objects, given the environmental issues that we're dealing with, is particularly important for the Gables. Next slide, please. So we also have an important archives made up of the usual kind of thing in archives: scrapbooks, photographs, paper books, lots of mixed media and ephemera. We also have a really important Hawthorne collection of first editions and rare printings and objects the family owned. And so we have an important archive that also requires special kind of consideration. So I just have to point out some of these things. So the book, I love this book because I don't know if any of you have ever actually read The House of the Seven Gables, but it takes place, in the, I think, late 1700s, early, maybe 1800. And I just love this cover of this book because it's like such a Gilded Age picture of this couple that's so romantic. And that's just so not the book. It's pretty funny. And then we have things like scripts from Bewitched. This is actually a Bewitched script from one of the Bewitched episodes that was filmed in Salem, and we had some filming done at the Gables way back in the day. So next slide, please. So in the larger collections management area, there are some ideal environmental conditions that museums try to maintain. These are kind of fluctuate based on the latest thinking, but in general, temperature ranges between 50 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit are considered ideal for collections stewardship. And within that, a relative humidity level of between 40 and 60% is recommended. As Paul mentioned before, temperature controls relative humidity levels or helps control relative humidity levels in a building, and humidity is really our enemy. But it's our enemy at high levels and our enemy at low levels, which we'll talk about a little bit. The really key important thing is to have a stable environment with minimal fluctuations. And that's really what keeps these objects safe over time. And next slide, please. So why are we so concerned with relative humidity? So organic matter absorbs and loses moisture. So I have some examples here in the pictures. You can see in the bottom right, That's a gate leg table from about 1750 that because of fluctuations in humidity levels over time, it's just warped and cracked to the point where part of the table has fallen apart, fallen off, and has to be conserved at some point. And that was absolutely due to contraction from changing humidity levels. We typically in the past, and Paul will talk about this more, have had in the winter, we have, because the heat is on and it's not as humid out, we have really some very, very, very low levels of humidity that's damaging to objects. And in the summer, we have pretty high levels of humidity, which also causes damage through warping and mold and other things that happen because of that. So in general, and you can see the books here, those are books that have mold on them, including a first edition of a Hawthorne piece. And the chair that you see, the stretchers have, because of warping and low humidity, the wood has turned brittle, and it's just kind of fallen apart, and it also has to be conserved. So we deal with this on a very regular basis with our objects, and we're trying really hard to build an environmental control so that we can mitigate these kinds of issues. And the other thing that I'm sure some of you in the museum field are dealing with are increased levels of pest activity and mold. And that's really, because it's warmer now and more humid, pests don't die off in the winter the way they used to, and they are more active for longer periods of time. And we definitely have seen the impact of that at the Gables as well. So all these factors just add to deterioration of this material over time. Inorganic material, also sensitive to humidity levels. If it's high humidity levels, salts will kind of leach out of material. I just see a question now. I'll answer that in a sec. We have our collections are spread across a number of different buildings. So we have none of them are fabulous, but we have a modern visitor center, which has the best environmental controls, and we have some things there. We also have collections that are stored in attics in our historic buildings. So I'll talk about that, our plans for dealing with that in a little bit. But next slide. So you can see that environmental controls are absolutely key to keeping our objects safe. So we thought we'd go through kind of a building by building discussion of things that we're doing to try and play with temperature and relative humidity to see how it affects the collections over time. So Paul, I think this is your.
Yeah. Well, I'll take it back, and we might have a little back and forth here, but basically the first building that we thought we would try this in, I think a more aggressive manner, and even that's still fairly moderate, is the Nathaniel Hawthorne birthplace. And that is because this is the only building that is just a museum place only. There's no offices. We do have collections inside it, but there's no collection storage, so it's just what's on display. So we went from a average 70-degree set point to a 62-degree winter set point and a 75-degree Fahrenheit set point. And we do have, we also installed as part of this project data loggers to help keep track of, the results of doing this. So we wanted to kind of know, is this going to have, a negative impact as we kind of try this out. And so this is actually me just kind of figuring out. We installed these data loggers in both buildings. The Gables we have for 2 years, the birthplace for 1 year. These results are fairly relatively new, but so here's what you can see in winter 2025, March 3 to 11. You can see the 62-degree temperature. This big spike is because of a heavy rainstorm that happened. So unavoidable unless we install humidistats. But in terms of keeping the temperature, you're seeing we're quite low in there. Dropping the temperature doesn't really seem to have, as you can see, as the day fluctuations go on, the relative humidity doesn't quite change that much. So we're seeing kind of the typical, there's very low relative humidity, but the temperature is reduced. So the hope is that there's less air infiltration going through the building at the same time. And then we also have our summer experiment as well. So this is our temperature set point. We have basically, we started at 75. here's actually what you'll see. This was the exact time when people started complaining, because we do have interpreters and guests that have to go through there. And they told me 75 is too hot. We need to reduce the temperature. So this is one of the things that we've been bumping up against a lot, which is just like, how do you deal with the human comfort factor when you want to try and push these things? When you have a lot of people who are such wildly different expectations for thermal comfort. So we started out this way. As you can see, at the higher levels, the relative humidity stayed within the range. In fact, it even dropped. Now that's because the relative humidity does tend to drop as the temperatures increase, because there's more capacity to hold air, which means that there's less likely that it's going to condense on objects and things. So there actually is a benefit to letting your temperature raise if you're not introducing new moisture sources. So, once it rains, that all goes out the window if you've got a kind of a damp foundation or damp basement. But if you're just dealing with the regular fluxes of temperature and humidity within sort of that your regular envelope, you let the temperature increase, it will actually drop the relative humidity. But again, of course, as you see, people got too hot.
Can I mention one thing? So
yeah.
The other thing we've done is we've installed dehumidifiers in the buildings, in the basements, where we have groundwater issues and flooding, seeping and flooding occasionally from storms. So we have dehumidifiers, we have data loggers, where we're really trying to monitor and stay on top of all of these kind of factors, and then over time we'll be able to see how this affects collection. So far, the good news is that we haven't had any mold outbreaks since this has gone in, which is really great, because mold is our enemy. Mm-hmm. But because the relative humidity levels are still low, it still has an issue. It's still an issue for our furniture. Although if the levels of relative humidity don't change except very gradually, it's okay. It's just when you have gradual, like you see this bump up in relative humidity from rain, that's a factor for the health of the collections in the building, because then you get swelling and warping and things.
Yeah. And that is with a dehumidifier in the basement. It takes time for we might have a slightly undersized dehumidifier, but it takes time to remove that moisture. So when you can, you want to if you're in, again, we have, I would say, a partially controlled envelope. We do have tar paper on the outside. Some of the walls have insulation, so it's not going to be able to breathe as quickly as it would as if it was a more traditional building envelope. So we do our best to basically condition that environment. Some things we can condition out: humidity when it's inside our building. When the humidity is outside our building, we can't control it. We control it by controlling the assembly. We can't obviously dehumidify the exterior, so we have to control our assembly, or we have to control the conditions in our building to handle what comes through. Hooper Hathaway. So this is a building that we haven't actually changed a whole lot. We did drop our winter set point. We didn't totally increase our summer set point, because we have a lot of collection storage in the attic there. But it's a very multi-purpose building. We have myself, education spaces, collection storage, and a wood shop as well. So this is one where, after a successful, investigation of this, type of study, that we may go and implement something maybe a bit more. But the idea is to kind of get some of these multi-function, multi-purpose elements out of the building. Retire Beckett, kind of the same story as Hooper Hathaway. We've actually had to keep it at a 70-degree around temperature. That's because we have many offices on the second floor. We also have the gift shop on the first floor. And there's also already a 5-degree fluctuation. So the thermostat's on the first floor here. Second floor, there's no stairway that's on the interior, so air doesn't really move between the two buildings. And so that it can be 5 or more degrees difference between upstairs and downstairs. So we try and keep the people in the office pretty happy up there as much as we can. I'll get into more how there's possible ways that we could keep people happy while changing the temperatures in those buildings. But the main issue, of course, is our Turner Ingersoll mansion, aka the House of Seven Gables. So we have, of course, the museum with museum exhibits. We do have one office in the House of Seven Gables, Susan. We also have collection storage spaces in our attics and an archaeological, archaeological and architectural elements stored in our basement as well. And we also get very high traffic, and I'll get into where kind of that mentions. But Susan, do you want to mention anything about collections in the Gables before we?
So just to mention, we have over 100,000 visitors a year who go through this house. And I will tell you that during the really busy months of September and October, it is just the impact of human bodies in the building, even as just from a dust perspective, is pretty amazing. And this is where I do want to mention that we have collection storage both in Hooper Hathaway attics and in the attics of this building, but none of those attics have environmental controls in them. So they are, I'll talk to you a little bit about plans we have for that. But right now, all of our collection storage in these two buildings are, there's no environmental control. So it gets quite hot and quite cold, quite humid and quite dry. And it's just really, really less than ideal. So we do the best we can to segregate object types so that the things that we store in these spaces are less susceptible to environmental changes. So for instance, all of our textiles we store in the modern basement of our visitor center, which has better environmental controls than these attic spaces do.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, thanks to the lovely impacts of stack effect, you do get some heating in those spaces, but from my perspective, thinking of the building preservation, of course, those barely heated attics is quite good for the building, but obviously quite not good for the collection. So, I made a note. The temperature set point varies. We did start to try and have it set to a pretty consistent. We had this winter example here. I had set it at 65, which I thought was pretty moderate, and you can sort of see doing the same thing as the birthplace, keeping within kind of the same normal ranges. We do have, of course, a rain event. I went and looked up each one of these spikes, and they coincide with rain when our basement basically shoots up the humidity anytime water kind of and humidity kind of shoots into those spaces. And then as you can actually see, this is a gradual incline of temperature in the outside. So another interesting impact in the environment around. But our other major source, as Susan mentioned, is varying internal sources of heat and moisture, aka people. So I did create a plan to try and deal with that. And actually you can sort of see the very regular introduction of that during our peak season. This is the second week of October. So you can see pretty regularly the spike in temperature and humidity when we get our first groups of visitors. And then the decline, because what I ended up doing is setting up a programmable thermostat. So we don't have humidistats. Humidistats would be the right thing to use, but you need to have both the HVAC controls to deal with that, but also an HVAC system that is sized to handle it, which we do not have either of. Would be something that I might be interested in employing, especially for the Gables. There might be other solutions as well, but what we did instead as a low-tech solution that can be done by anyone who has similar type fluctuations of visitation is to program your thermostats to pre-cool in anticipation of people coming. So that way you've got your air system already circulating and moving air during the times when people are coming. So the way the program thermostats, they're all mostly made for residences, which means that they're programmed for when people wake up in the morning, go to work, come home from work, and then go to bed. So there's 4 points in the day that you can set, and it's called the sleep is overnight, but I'll actually jump over to wake. So wake up, you set it to start ramping up slowly from the sleep temperature was 75. So this is in cooling season. I had it move to 72 degrees about 2 hours before we open. And then by 9:40, so it jumps down to 68 just as people are starting to enter the building. So that way the fan is running and it's moving that humidity that they come, as they're coming through the building. And I keep that set point until just basically about a half hour before or after we close. That closing time fluctuates. And then I let it return back up to 72 degrees, and then also then slowly move back up to 75 overnight. And the time blinked out, but that was set at about 9 o'clock p.m. So that's one way you can do it. And if you have other times you anticipate, you can kind of play with those 4 settings for something that might work more for you. But just a little practical application there. Oh, there's the sleep time, 9 p.m. And then the other thing, this is kind of talking about how dealing with comfort for humans, whether it's visitors or if it's offices, if you happen to have offices in a historic house, keep your building at a lower set point, 65 degrees or 60 degrees if you can manage it. And then for human comfort, zone controls. So we actually went and I did research on what are some of the safest space heaters you can. Space heaters, I know for some are a big red alarm. There can be safe ones, but you also have to make sure that people use them safely. But this one has a no tip alarm, or basically a no tip or a tip shut off. So if it ever tips, it shuts off automatically. And surge protections, make sure you're plugging them in directly to outlets, not plugging into power strips, those types of things. Inspect them, make sure that they are being used safely and that they're not damaged. Or you can do zoned heating through mini splits, heat pumps, and we actually installed some of our first out in the Gables, but in another building unrelated. But that can be really helpful. There also are infrared space heaters. So those are actually, they don't give off warm air. They basically are like little tanning salons, but they'll warm up your skin. And so you feel comfortable, even though the rest of the air temperature around your body could be 65 degrees, your skin will be warmed to, provide more comfort. That's not something that I bought, but it is something that could be looked into. And then of course, what we really came into, and I guess I can let Susan, you can take it away, but we know that what we have to do is kind of better balance our collections amongst our historic buildings and into a better storage situation.
Right. So, it's really interesting balancing all these competing needs of human comfort, the preservation of the historic structures, the preservation of the collection. So it's kind of a constant negotiation and battle we're doing. And I must say I have my space heater on cranking in my office right now because Gables itself is freezing right now. So we have an historic, a modern visitor center and a large basement. And in that basement, it was mixed use for a while. It used to be, maintenance, preservation kept stuff there, functions kept stuff there, education kept stuff there. And some collection storage. So we've taken away just about everything but collections and archives down there. And we actually got an NEH grant this year, which is mind-boggling, but we haven't gotten any money from it yet because I don't know what's going to happen with that. But
hung up in Congress.
yeah. So we are planning a improved collection storage space in the visitor center basement, which will include upgraded environmental controls. It's still the most stable space we have on the property for environmental controls for collections, but we'll upgrade that. We'll do some waterproofing just in case, for future reference. And then we're going to move as much of our collections as all those collections in the attic and as much of the material as we can to this space. We also have an archives in this space that will be upgraded as well so that we can have some really creative use of storage equipment that will allow us to fit as much as we can down in this space. And what's really interesting is, Paul mentioned that we have a climate adaptation plan in place, and we are moving forward on that. And that does involve, over a 50-year period, relocating all of our buildings up the property to where our current parking lot is. So because of coastal flooding that we'll be experiencing. So one of the things we want to make sure is whatever we do in this space, we can reuse when we build another building that will house collections in the future. So those are all factors that we're considering. At the same time, we're dealing with just kind of improving the internal environmental controls in the buildings. But in this space, we'll have things like anything that is all of our furniture, we can fit it in. all of our textiles, all the things that are most kind of uh, affected by humidity levels. And we may have to leave some things in collection storage spaces in the buildings, in which case we'll identify those things that are least likely to be impacted by changes in relative humidity and leave those objects there, like maybe porcelain or maybe some metal pieces. So this is a project we're about to undertake as soon as we get the funding in from NEH, and we're really excited about making those improvements because it's less than ideal, the current situation we have with collection storage. And that was all I had to say about that. Do you want to add anything, Paul?
No. Just a couple of references from some of the sources that I gleaned from for this, but also just very familiar with. But I think we got questions, so we should probably take some of those. Do we want to? Heather, are you playing moderator for
Yep.
questions
So
first,
you
or should I go
actually,
Dave?
I think you did answer quite a few of them. Um, okay, there was one from earlier. Can you discuss HVAC humidity control from the aspect of steam versus media humidifiers, pros and cons?
Sorry. Did you say humidifier?
HVAC humidity control
Yeah.
aspect.
So one of the things that, and this is, I think, has been fairly well established in the preservation with respect to like wood buildings, humidification is very bad. You don't want to be artificially introducing more moisture, even if you have, a 20% or even lower environment. That moisture that you introduce is just going to go straight into the walls, because when you have those really low humidity conditions inside of a historic building, there's going to be a huge amount of air drive through the building assembly, and that moisture is just going to go straight in there, and you're going to find that condensing in there and creating moisture issues. So that is one of the tough things, and it's one of the things why it is, one of the main litmuses to kind of evaluate our historic buildings the best places for storing, sensitive collections. And my only caveat, I guess, would be is that some of these things, not all, were in these buildings back when they were being used originally the way that kept them preserved best. But obviously, major exceptions.
And our climate's changed a little bit.
Yeah, that too.
How much does exterior paint type impact moisture retention, acrylic versus linseed oil paint, for example?
Oh, major. So actually I'd start with interior paint. So interior, whether acrylic paints are a really good moisture barrier. So that way, so if you have a acrylic painted interior, that actually will stop a lot of that moisture migration through. Now, granted, there's still going to be gaps in other places, like your floors. Basically, the spaces between floors are going to be, that's where you tend to get most of that moisture migration. But you'll find in a house that has, a painted interior that paint actually deflects and becomes that new condensation, where a more vapor permeable paint would have allowed it to pass through the building assembly before. But then, of course, the bad thing is that if you have it on the outside, anything that gets through there is now going to condense on the back side of that paint and then bubble out that paint. So, the paint is like adding basically a raincoat at a certain layer. And if you have a vapor permeable material at any point, and then that vapor impermeable surface becomes the condensation plane. It'll become a new condensation plane, where it might have been more fuzzy, the moisture might have been more dispersed throughout different areas where it might be more easily to dry. Suddenly it's all stopping in one place. And so that can be a real issue.
Another one is, what data loggers are you using? Because we all like to know these things.
Oh yeah, we're using the
There's
Hobo
so many
data
of
loggers.
them.
Yeah, we're using the Hobo loggers.
Okay. How did pest activity react to the change in the temperature? And I also will plug for our Ask the Conservators. They deal with mold and pest infestations all the time. So I would strongly encourage you guys to join that webinar as well.
Yeah, so we have the answer is somewhat. So we have in the inside of the buildings, we have we have issues with carpentry, and sometimes that comes from the outside. That's because of dampness in the outside, and a lot of times that's just being aware of it. So we have an IPM system set up. We always know when that activity starts. We always work with Paul to let him know so he can take appropriate action. We have an intractable webbing closed moth problem in the house, the Turner Ingersoll mansion, and that is better. And that's partly because we're keeping those spaces as clean as we can and really monitoring things and taking out as much kind of material that they like to eat as possible, which is hard given our textiles and things. But that is intractable because just the building itself, we of course there are plaster walls, we have those interstices areas that Paul mentioned are filled with almost 400 years of
Organic
dust and
material is the
material
best way to
and
put it.
dead animals and so they'll always find things to eat in our spaces, no matter how clean and perfect we keep them.
Yeah.
So
I,
we have noticed that there was an uptick of them. Definitely, for sure, we've had an uptick of them over the last 5 years, let's say, and that's I think largely due to the environment, the exterior environment.
I'm hoping we did put dehumidifiers in the basement of the gables that will help. That's a fairly recent development because obviously, and again, kind of getting into it, those dehumidifiers are still only keeping the basement at about 60% relative humidity,
Right.
as opposed to where it was like 80-90% at some point.
Right.
But hoping that cutting on some of that moisture reduces some of the growth of the organic material that feeds those. But
Right.
we'll have to see.
It certainly helped us with our mold problems that we've had. So we find that air movement is really important to kind of keep mold at bay as well. So if you have a particularly kind of dead space where you're storing things or have had mold problems, once you kind of deal with the mold issue, is to put a little fan in there, something to just keep the air kind of moving so that there's not dead air in the space. So that has gotten better, and also just because we're on top of it a lot more than we used to be 10 years ago or so.
That's good. So we are at past the 4 o'clock hour. Does anybody have any last minute questions for Paul and Suzanne? You can go ahead, unmute yourself, put it in the chat. If not, I'm sure they would have follow-up. If you have any follow-up questions, you could definitely contact them.
Absolutely. We'd love to hear from you anytime.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the pest webinar is actually Ask the Conservators. So they do a lot of conservation stuff. I should have looked at the calendar. We do have one at the end of December if you want to join. It's more of a show and tell, but they mainly deal with textiles and furniture, but they are open to any questions during the Ask the Conservators. They usually have a special guest. Rosamond Marie has been to all of them. So yeah, she's on the call here today. So that's definitely a group to definitely involve if you do have any type of issues with conservation stuff, including mold and other pests. But it looks like we have a bunch of thank yous, which is great. So Matt, do you want to close us out?
Sure. I'll just say that since we had such a large turnout, upwards of 50 participants today, that's really good for this community of practice, and we'd love to invite you back. We typically meet monthly, although we also typically skip January. So look for us in February, and we kind of structure these conversations as a presentation like today. Call it a guest speaker or words from the field, and then our next meeting is more of a conversation, what's on your mind? What would you like to see in programming? What is your expertise that you can have some dialogue with other members of the community of practice? So that's what we'll return to in February, and then look for another guest speaker in March. And I can't tell you what that is because I don't think we know yet.
Probably not. Everything will be announced on the NEMA website too. So
yeah.
All right.
So,
well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah. So final words are thank you and happy holidays to everyone, and stay warm. Stay warm with the blast.
Thanks for everybody. Thanks for everybody coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan and Paul. Thank you so
All right.
much.
It was our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.